MotoGP's first 2025 pre-season test at Sepang in Malaysia has finished. Here are the 5 biggest things we learned from the week. The manufacturer that clearly had the most to be pleased about, even though it didn't quite top the times in the end, was Yamaha. Here's Simon in the Sepang paddock with more on Yamaha's week.
There's an argument to be made for multiple factories as being the ones that have had a most successful time at the 3 days here at Sepang, but for me, the one that stands head and shoulders above all the rest is the factory Yamaha squad, simply because of the massive amount of progress we've seen them make relative to where they were even just a few months ago whenever we last raced at Sepang in November. We've seen Fabio Quartararo go almost a second faster than his qualifying time from back then. And while everyone else has made a step forward, the only way that Yamaha are really going to be able to close the gap and get back to where they want to be fighting for championships is to be making more of an improvement than everyone else. So you have to remember sometimes at these tests that while an improvement is good, it doesn't matter if you're going half a second faster while the red bikes in the factory Ducati box are doing the same thing. So to be making those sort of big steps, to consistently be at the front the whole way through this test so far, that's the sort of thing that in the long run is going to take them back to where they want to be, fighting for podiums every weekend and eventually fighting for championships. It's worth noting that all of this as well, all of these big improvements have come without a V4 engine. There's been so much talk coming into here about what Yamaha are going to do, about bringing this new engine package and finally moving away from the inline 4 that they've dominated MotoGP with in the past. But it's not here yet. There's no timeline on when it's going to arrive, and the work that we're seeing being done here is still being done with an inline 4. Now, of course, part of the problem there, and something to bear in mind, is that we have traditionally seen that the inline 4s suffer more during races because they're at a speed disadvantage to the V4s, and they tend to get gobbled up in the pack a little bit and have quite a bit of difficulty overtaking because their strength comes from corner speed. But Quartararo's strength on the Yamaha, almost since his very, very first few laps on it in Qatar way back in 2019 as a rookie with the Petronas team, has been his qualifying speed, and that's something that he's lost of late. So even if he can find that and bring that back again, that gives him a huge advantage going forwards. You're fine, don't worry.
Well, Yamaha was surprising everybody. The team everyone is expected to top the test, the season, any kind of MotoGP running for the last few years is the factory Ducati team. This was Marc Marquez's first week in full factory colours alongside Pecco Bagnaia. Some really ominous long run times, in particular from those two, but a quandary for Ducati as well. It hasn't been completely simple for the team to dominate the season.
Yeah, it's been a good test. It's certainly not been a problematic test. There is clearly the potential in that Ducati factory team to almost certainly dominate this season. We've seen no evidence to the contrary in these 3 days in Sepang. They've both had like a crash apiece, but they've both been fairly consistently towards the top of the timesheets. When they had to do a single lap, they've done a pretty good job. They didn't top the test, more on that later, but they were both close enough, and certainly that long run pace is still much better than what the non-Ducati rivals can offer. But, and it is a substantial but, they are not yet confident as to what spec to go into the season with. There's a major GP25, GP24 quandary going on, and it relates primarily to the engine, but also to other parts of the bike. Obviously, MotoGP is governed by homologation rules. On the aero package side, there are some restrictions as to how many changes you can actually make in a season, and for manufacturing Ducati's place, it's not a lot of changes. On the engine side, you can make no changes at all. You have to decide what you're going to run for the season before the season starts. And this year, for Ducati and for two of its peers, the case is that you have to decide what you're going to run this season. And also in 2026, you cannot make a mistake. You absolutely, positively cannot make a mistake. And that sort of has added to the anxiety that is palpable in some of the Ducati riders' answers, even though clearly the new engine is already pretty good. It is smoother than the old engine, but the braking performance isn't quite there. And at Sepang, it seems like the trade-off was more in favor of the older bike, but it's such an imprecise science. The track conditions in the test, because all of the rubber is being laid down, they're very different to what you get in the race weekend. So they need engineering help and a lot of engineering analysis right now to understand what is the more sensible version to pursue going forward. Marc Marquez used the word conservative, as sort of a point of emphasis, and in the sense that he's well aware, as are all of we, that the 24 Ducati won 19 of the 20 Grand Prix last season. You only move on from that if you're pretty confident you have something better. Right now they are not confident. There's a bit of secrecy even into, with both the sprint long runs and the single lap pace as to what bikes were actually being used for that. Sometimes it's, hybrids, one sort of engine in one sort of aero in one sort of chassis. And on all of those pieces, they have to make some sort of decision, and only some of them can they really change and modify in season. And it is very important to remember, a couple of years ago, Ducati went in with a pretty good bike, maybe made a few too many changes to it, to the point where Pecco Bagnaia sort of started the season on a hybrid spec, and Jorge Martin and I think Luca Marini also, they started the season on a newer version of the Ducati. And that newer version, the newest version that Pecco Bagnaia rejected, didn't work at all. So Martin's season was basically he would say ruined, and I would generally agree with that. And Bagnaia didn't really recover fully from that botched preseason until the halfway point. They nearly lost the title to Fabio Quartararo Yamaha that they had no business losing to. So you can really mess up here, basically.
So while Ducati was figuring out its new package, the riders who had the old Ducati package that dominated last season were actually in pretty good shape. Now, we often say that pre-season, that you have the sorted Ducati from last year, you're on to a very strong start to the season. But that wasn't the case in 2024. Back to business as usual, though, for everyone on a year-old Ducati going into 25.
No, yeah, in 2024, the three newer spec Ducatis all topped the test. In 2025, no such case. In fact, in 2025, the GP24s, as you would expect, have looked very good at Sepang. They don't have to try new bits. They just, run laps on setups on the bike that is already refined and is already race proven. But it is interesting. We've had Alex Marquez set both the fastest lap of the test and record the best sprint, because we saw Marc Marquez's sprint simulation. And we were like, oh, that's amazing. It's genuinely super, super impressive. And then Alex Marquez did one, and his was somehow marginally better, it is phenomenal. We know that Alex Marquez is a Sepang specialist. He loves the track. If he is going to be a Grand Prix winner in the dry, it's probably going to come at Sepang one of these years. But still, it's very relevant, and I think it adds to the factory Ducati anxiety, or at least I suspect, when Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Marquez are thinking about whether to commit to the 2025 engine and other 2025 bits. I don't think they're worried about the KTM so much, the Aprilia, the Yamaha, whatever, for all the improvements. I think they're worried about the older, more refined Ducatis and losing too much ground to them, even though maybe obviously the rider lineup on those Ducatis isn't as star-studded. Franco Morbidelli also had a very, very good week on the year-old Ducati. He was asked by the official broadcaster whether he would have the chance to win in the first rounds, basically, with the current situation, and he didn't deny it. And I think expect there actually being like 6 properly multiple spec Ducatis at the front this year, and that's even assuming that the Works Ducati team doesn't just revert to the old bike and we just go with 6 identical Ducatis, which probably isn't going to happen, but there might not be as big a gulf in spec as you would have expected.
It's pretty fair to say that this is not the test that the Aprilia guys behind me expected whenever they turned up to Sepang. We saw, obviously, their number one rider, their literal number one, the new world champion Jorge Martin, ruled out of action basically an hour into the test on the first day when he had that horrific turn 2 high side. We've a lot of today talking about tyres and talking about what exactly caused that crash after Aprilia kind of very squarely put the blame for it on Michelin early on in the week. Michelin boss Piero Taramasso came to the media centre earlier today to explain to us that actually what happened was a bit of an unusual one. So there's 4 temperature readings that we can take from a MotoGP tyre. There's the surface temperature, there's a temperature whenever Michelin's technicians insert a probe into the tyre, there's the temperature of the air inside the tyre, and then there's the temperature of the inside surface of the tyre. What we normally rely on for things like sending the guys out on track is that surface temperature reading, because it's the one that's the easiest to take. It's the one that the sensors inside the tyre warmers pick up on. But what had actually happened was, it seems, because of his crash, his first crash, about 45 minutes before the one that left him badly injured, Martin's inside tyre temperature was about 15 degrees lower than expected. So as a result, the data that Aprilia had on the actual temperature of the tyre as they saw it said that the tyre was up to temperature, but only whenever Michelin did a deep dive into the data, it showed that actually the tyre was quite a bit colder than it should have been. And that's where the crash came from. These tyres are super sensitive, they have a narrow window, and we know that the medium tyre that he was using was already on the limit of that window, and not a lot of the guys were comfortable using it, but felt that because of the allocation, they had to get it out of the way beforehand. So an error, not really, more just an unusual series of circumstances that isn't really Michelin's fault, isn't really Aprilia's fault, isn't really Jorge Martin's fault, but will probably mean that going forward, at least some of the teams will change how they go about preparing tyres to put them onto the bike, and which sensors and which data they use to make sure the tyres are up to temperature before a rider goes out on them. Despite losing Martin early on in the weekend, it's still not been a terrible test for Aprilia. Marco Bezzecchi's had really strong, impressive pace. He did a race simulation, or a sprint race simulation on the final day that was strong. He's quick overall. For a rider who's adopting from a different bike, honestly, it's a good test. It's disappointing that we don't have Martin and, of course, Raul Fernandez, who also got hurt early on in the test, as a benchmark or as a comparison. Only the rookie Ayagura and the second Satellite Trackhouse bike. But honestly, this still bodes pretty well for Aprilia's chances this year. We just need to see what happens whenever we get Martin back on track, how long it's going to take him to recover from those injuries, how long it's going to take him to finish his adaptation process, and then what the rest of 2025 looks like for the new world champion.
Two manufacturers had a really good test then. Aprilia clearly didn't. Honda and KTM, the other two in the field, they're probably more close to the Aprilia way of looking at this week than Ducati and Yamaha, I guess.
Yeah, they won't say it publicly. Publicly, the rhetoric is pretty positive, but certainly I don't think they have as much to smile about as Yamaha or Ducati. And I'm not convinced it's even particularly close. I mean, a quick word on KTM, because we're reading tea leaves there. They're fully admitting that they haven't really put the bike together. They haven't really looked for a true performance run at Sepang. So, the headline lap times aren't very pretty. The long run wasn't very pretty, but it's probably not supposed to be representative. And normally you'd say not true, but a little true, because KTM does this every year. So, yeah. So KTM, maybe don't read into it too much. Honda, I don't get. I don't really understand what I'm supposed to make of this Honda test, because Joan Mir, the paddock's unhappiest rider, or at least up there over the past 2 years, seems to have had a really good test and feels quite good about the bike. And okay, the headline lap times seem all right, but I don't understand why. I don't see it in the lap times. And while he talks very positively about, the improved turning and the new bits in the process and all just the quality of work done, the methods of work done, but the big issues that Honda had, they're still there. The bike is still not competitive on top speed. The bike is still not good on rear grip. The bike still vibrates on the rear, which wrote off much of Mir's 2024 season. I think Luca Marini put it best. I mean, they're happy enough, but still very far. Very, very far is the word. And for me, the big question is, I think it's easy to be positive in a test and easy to be, sunshine and rainbows in a test, even when there's a big gap, when you feel you're working well. But when you come into a race weekend and you find that there's a second missing and you can't find it, it's a question of whether you can stick to your method and whether you can work methodically without losing your head and without losing the way like Honda seemed to at various points last year. Obviously, with Honda, the important caveat is the new big technical signing, Verano Bessiano, still has not had a time to have the impact that he's going to have. But right now, it was just sort of another preseason Honda test. And like with KTM, for me, I've seen them be happy enough coming out of the test without the lap time evidence to prove it. And then the weekend started and suddenly, everyone's mad and everyone's sad. Maybe, hopefully, that won't be the case this year. I'm not ready to commit to that being the case yet.